I would like to welcome all of you to the Ideas 42 Academy Seminar Series. My name is Mitra Salosel, and I'm the Director of Communications at Ideas 42. And on behalf of all of us on the team, I want to thank you for tuning in to learn more about applying behavioral science to tough social problems. Today, we are joined by one of our esteemed academic affiliates, Rodrigo Canales, to explore a critical topic: effective, resilient, and trusted police organizations. Rodrigo Canales is an associate professor of organizational behavior at the Yale School of Management. His research is at the intersection of organizational theory and institutional theory, with a special interest in the role of institutions for economic development. Specifically, he studies how individuals are affected by and in turn purposefully change complex organizations or systems. Today, he'll be giving us a look at a field experiment in Mexico that evaluated the efficacy and feasibility of improving the legitimacy of the police through training police officers and mid-level commanders on the concepts and techniques of procedural justice, as well as a look at some of the other components of the research he is conducting on issues of organizational design for police forces in Mexico. Before I hand it off to Rodrigo to get us started, a small logistical matter for those who may be new to the Academy Seminar Series, or for those of you who aren't, just a review, we'll there's a box at the bottom, so as you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in. And like I said, we will be collecting them all at the end, and we have built in some space to answer all of those questions live. And apologies if my internet is freezing, but all right, without further ado, Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mitra. Just thumbs up to make sure that you can hear me well. And I can only see you, Mitra, so I'm gonna, okay, good. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I've long been a fan of what Ideas 42 does. Some of my favorite former students work at Ideas 42. And so I always try to stay as connected as possible to the organization and to everything that you do. And so thank you for inviting me. It's a true honor and pleasure to be here. And as Mitra mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a component of the research that we've been doing on the question of how to build effective, resilient, and trusted police forces. You know, normally in previous eras, I had to spend a couple of minutes kind of building the motivation for our work. Unfortunately, given everything that's been happening recently, you know, good for our research, not great for the world. Like it's become, I think, self-evident that this is an important question. Like, you know, how do we create police organizations that are not only effective, but also are resilient to the threats that they experience from the outside, and critically, that they are trusted by the citizens that they promise to serve. And so this is research that we've been working on for some time now. And our research broadly takes on this perspective of, number one, we take an organizational approach. And so we look at police forces first and foremost as complex organizations that, you know, where the structural and the organizational features of a police force are going to greatly determine how people behave within it. And then we ask kind of questions of, like, you know, given like what we know about what kinds of structures would work best for a police organization, what are approaches to police reform that seem more promising? And then we also ask questions about enactment of specific practices. So if there are specific practices that we know are critical for police organizations, how do we go about properly situating them within the complex organizational structure of a police force? And I would say that today's talk fits more within that third one. But you'll see what I mean in a minute. And so in general, we have two very big work streams in our research. Both of them have been mostly situated in Mexico, although not exclusively. One big question is, I'll start with number two, is this question of designing effective, resilient, and trusted police departments. And there what we've been doing is just analyzing hundreds of different police organizations, what kinds of structures they put in place, what kinds of processes, practices, systems they use, what kind of managerial practices they follow internally. And we compare and contrast across these hundreds of police organizations to get some insights about what are patterns that we see in terms of better ways of structurally designing a police organization? And then stream one, which is the one that I'm going to be talking more about today, is this question of citizen trust. And it focuses on kind of citizen perception and participation in public safety. And so how do you go about rebuilding a relationship and a contract of trust between the police and citizens? And again, normally I spend some time talking about the motivation, but I think given what's happening these days, it's become much more evident, like why trust between the police and citizens is truly critical. Before I go any further, I just want to mention that the work that we've been doing is basically the result of the effort and commitment of a large and just wonderful group of people that we work with in Mexico. So this is basically the team that we have in Mexico. Just an incredibly talented and committed group of researchers that have done incredible work. And I just want to thank them publicly. Anything and everything that you like in what I present today is because of them. If there are things that you don't like, it's because I'm doing a poor job in presenting it, because they truly do wonderful work. And so today I'm going to be talking, as Mitra mentioned, about one of our one of the streams of our work, which is how do you rebuild trust between citizens and the police? And basically what we ended up doing, and I'm going to explain why in a second, is we did a randomized control trial of training police officers in Mexico in procedural justice. And I'll come back to kind of explain a little bit on why. And so basically in general, what we know is that trust is not something that you can create directly. Like trust is not something that just happens in the abstract, especially trust in a figure of authority. We have decades of research, both in organizational justice, but also in the legal system, that shows us that, whether you trust an authoritative figure or not has a lot to do with whether you perceive them to be legitimate. And whether you perceive them to be legitimate kind of depends on two big things. One is the results that they give. And so what kinds of outcomes do you observe coming out of this position of authority? And it turns out that people care about outcomes, but that's not how they make the larger portion of their judgments about legitimacy. Turns out that when people are evaluating legitimacy, they care much more about the means through which authority figures accomplish the results than the results themselves. And that's been shown, again, decades of research on organizational justice and the justice system in general has shown that when people are evaluating the legitimacy of an authority figure, the way things are done or the means that authority figures use to achieve their results matter a lot more. And so, for decades, people have been kind of unpacking legitimacy and perceptions of justice as an independent variable. So what are the different components of justice that lead to people evaluating an authority figure as legitimate and therefore feeling like they can trust them? And, in the policing and legal realm, again, there's just a lot of support for the idea that when authority figures follow 4 principles of procedural justice, and sometimes they unpack it differently, right? Sometimes they unpack it as, procedural, interactional, informational justice. But especially in the policing world, we tend to lump them all into the label of procedural justice. If you're interested, I'm happy to go into more detail as to why. It doesn't really matter for the talk, because the principles stay the same, meaning when figures of authority give the people in less power, in this case, when a police officer gives citizens voice, when police officers show neutrality, when they show respect, and when they show reliability or trustworthiness, people perceive that interaction to have been fair, and therefore they perceive that authority figure to be more legitimate, and therefore they feel like they can trust the institution more. And obviously this is a repeated thing, right? So the more you see police officers incorporate these 4 principles of procedural justice into what they do, the more you feel like as representatives of their institution, they are legitimate, and therefore the more you feel like you can trust the institution as an entity. And again, there's decades of research that show the robustness of this finding that these 4 components of justice kind of translate to a perception of legitimacy. And traditionally, research has treated justice, as I mentioned, as an independent variable. And so let me show you that when justice is present, and let me identify how like the different components of justice translate to important outcomes that we care about, including trust. The way this has traditionally been done is we study a lot of different police officers. We see how they kind of operate in the wild, and we study them very carefully. And then we identify that the ones who incorporate these principles tend to be trusted more. And that's kind of how we've generally extracted these ideas. Or we study judges and courts, right? What we were trying to do in our research is say, like, listen, there's a lot of theoretical support for the idea that procedural justice is what matters most to build trust with citizens, but it's usually treated as an independent variable. We should treat it as a dependent variable for a change, meaning, can we actually change it? Can we change the extent to which police officers incorporate procedural justice into their work? And therefore, can we nudge the needle of how they interact with the public? And that's what we were trying to do in this research, right? And so when we were asking the question of how do we rebuild trust between citizens and the police, procedural justice came up as the theoretical construct with the most evidentiary support. And that's why we decided to say, like, all right, this is what this research should be, but we're going to treat it as a dependent variable, which is not done. It hasn't been tested, certainly not in an experimental context before our work. So that was the idea. Now, before we did it, we decided that we needed to first do a lot of co-design with Mexican police officers, because most of the research on procedural justice has been conducted in the US, some in Europe and some in other places, but the vast majority has been US focused. And so once we decided that procedural justice was the frame we needed to do, we spent just a lot of time first analyzing what had been tried, what had been done in other places, how people seek to incorporate procedural justice into, for example, how they train police officers in other settings. We translated all that content into Spanish, and then we sat down with police officers that were identified as particularly experienced and particularly good, to have them help us co-design the research. And so they would like, we would explain the principles, and they would say, like, well, if I was going to explain this to my peers, these are the concepts that I would use, or these are the words that I would use. That example that you're showing us doesn't really resonate in Mexico. We need a different example. And so then they would give us examples that would work. And so we went through 3 rounds of this kind of pilot training and co-design with police officers to tweak the training program. And obviously we changed it a lot through this process. From that, we then followed this experimental design. And I'm sorry that I'm kind of rushing through this, but I do want to leave enough time for questions at the end. And I have a lot of different cool results to discuss with you. So I'm going to kind of rush through all of this, and then hopefully you can ask any clarifying questions or reactions when I'm done with all of this. And so the basic experimental design is that Mexico City, you should think of the Mexico City police kind of like the New York City police. They're very similar in many ways, both in how they're organized internally, but also the extension of and size of the force. There are about 80,000 police officers in Mexico City. They are distributed in 850 quadrants that are then subdivided into 72 sectors that are subdivided into 15 regions. And so for a variety of reasons, we ended up deciding that the appropriate kind of unit of randomization would be the sector unit, meaning, so again, if you're mind, there are 850 sectors, which is how they divide Mexico City. So these are the ones that you see in this map. And those are aggregated into 72 sectors. So we took out 12 sectors that were somewhat unusual, either in their geographic characteristics, like there's some sectors that are almost kind of borderline rural in their layout. And so we took them out of consideration. So we took out 12 sectors that were quite unusual. The other 60, we kind of randomized. We did a pairwise matching. And so we found sectors that were most similar to each other in pairs. And then once we had these pairs of sectors, they were randomly assigned to either treatment or control. And from this random assignment, then we picked 2,000 officers, 1,000 for treatment and 1,000 for control, more or less, from within these 60 sectors that were randomly allocated to treatment or control. So the idea was that if you're in a treatment sector, only police officers who are in treatment sectors will be assigned to treatment, and only police officers who are in control sectors will be assigned to control. So this was kind of the basic design. This is what the distribution of treatment and control ended up looking like. And because we had some attrition, because of some logistical difficulties, etc., we ended up with 860 police officers, like line police officers from the 30 sectors who were trained for 3 days. And we had 61 of their managers from these 30 sectors who were trained. And the manager training was slightly longer because it included some things about kind of fair leadership and just basic managerial principles, and including procedural justice, not just with citizens, but also within the force. And so kind of the importance of treating your police officers with procedural justice if you expect to them to treat citizens with procedural justice as well. So this is kind of the basic setup, right? We ended up with basically 900 plus police officers in the treatment function, or the treatment, sorry, and about a similar amount of police officers in the control. I don't expect you to look at this table in any kind of detail, but this is basically the comparison between treatment and control. And we try to match treatment and control groups very carefully, and as a result, it's a very balanced comparison between treatment and control, except for one thing, really. If you go almost to the bottom, you'll see rules, and that's a baseline perception of the importance of rules. And we had a small difference where police officers in treatment had a slightly higher opinion of the importance of rules. It's a small difference, but it was statistically significant. And so in all the specifications that we show you, we control for that. We control for that baseline difference between them. It doesn't really change our results if we control for it or if we don't, partly because the difference is quite small, even though it is statistically significant. And so then, the implementation basically was, as I was saying, this kind of 3-day process of small groups of police officers. So we divided these police officers into groups of about 20 to 25 people. There's a number of reasons why that ended up being the design, but we saw in our pilots that that's what worked best. And so we start with this idea that police trust is not kind of something that is nice to have at the end of whether you're a good cop or not, but without having citizen trust, you cannot do your job. And so police legitimacy and citizen trust is a basic principle of operational efficacy. And we start with kind of a lot of discussion about that. Then we walk them through the 4 principles of procedural justice, both the theory of it, but then the practicality of it, including toolkits for handling specific situations and how to incorporate procedural justice into these interactions. We have them actually experience that and practice with each other, and we put them in scenarios where they have to kind of actually practice. And then we have a pretty broad discussion about the relationship between citizens and the police in Mexico City, both from the structure of how it's a complicated relationship in general between the police and citizens. And Mexico City has a complex history that has a series of pretty dark moments. And so we also had a discussion about that, because that's a legacy that they're carrying. Even if they had nothing to do with it, they're still carrying that legacy. And we wanted to have a discussion about what do you do with that legacy when you're trying to incorporate procedural justice in the next interaction that you're going to have with citizens. And kind of at the core of the training is this idea that resonated with him a lot, that we should think of trust between police and citizens as kind of a community bank of trust, where we all benefit or we all suffer from how large the balance is in that kind of bank account. And every interaction between an authority figure and a citizen is an opportunity to either make a deposit to that account or create a withdrawal from that account. And that deposit or that withdrawal is going to affect everybody else. And so if a police officer who's working in a different sector makes a deposit, it benefits me, who I'm a police officer in a different sector. A withdrawal by them affects me as well. And this resonated a lot with them. And we had a lot of conversations about, for example, the nature of deposits versus withdrawals, where deposits tend to be very small and you have to make a lot of them to make a difference, whereas withdrawals tend to be quick and big and kind of disproportionate, right? And so that's kind of the basic structure of the training. I'm happy to go into more detail if people are curious about this. And so then the question was, if we're going to treat trust as a dependent variable, meaning if we want to see whether training people can actually change how they behave, then our decision was that we need to evaluate them on 3 different dimensions, because three things would have to be true for training to actually work. The first is that they would have to comprehend the training, meaning they have to intellectually understand what it was and remember it, right? And so that's the first thing. The second is that they also have to internalize it. Like research does show that when people kind of go through the motions of procedurally just actions, but it's not sincere, people can identify this. And so this has to be internalized in order to work. And third, and most important, it actually has to change behavior. And so the question is, how do we measure these three things to test whether the training actually had an impact? And what I'm going to walk you through in the next few minutes is the results in the three instruments for evaluation that we designed. The first one is kind of simple, right? Whether you understand and remember stuff. We just did a baseline and an end-line survey with treatment and control people to see whether at the beginning, to measure how they felt at the beginning about concepts of procedural justice and citizen trust and citizen behavior. And then we had an end-line survey, again, with treatment and control to see how they felt at the end, 3 to 6 months after they had received the training. And obviously then we do a differences and differences where we see differences between end-line and baseline for treatment versus differences between end-line and baseline for control. In order to test whether they internalize behavior, we followed a photojournal and interview methodology that I'm going to describe in a second. And for behavioral changes, we ended up doing simulated interactions, or a mystery shopper instrument that I'm going to discuss in a minute. Excuse me. And so quickly walking you through the results. And so the first one, again, is the comparison between baseline and end-line. The big headline is we found a pretty significant effect of training. This is controlling for everything, right? Like what I'm going to show you from now on is the results of our most conservative specifications, which include sector controls, police officer controls, meaning their socio-demographic characteristics. It includes controls for the baseline perceptions that were not balanced between treatment and control at the beginning of the intervention. And obviously we're clustering everything at the sector level. And so we're using bootstrapping clustered standard errors for everything that we do. And so all that I'm going to show you is, again, using these most conservative specifications. And so the big headline is there's a pretty significant effect, and it's a standardized effect of about 0.4, meaning the way to understand it is a police officer who was in the bottom quartile of distribution at baseline, through training would be pushed up to just above the median in terms of how they thought about the importance of citizen trust and how they responded to questions of, for example, the importance of neutrality or the importance of respect or the importance of giving voice. So there's a shift across the entire distribution of about kind of a quarter of the distribution. If you were in the bottom quartile, you would go up to the median. If you were in the median, you would go up to the top quartile. So it's a substantial effect, especially given that we are estimating it in the most kind of conservative way possible. And we find that it's pretty, this is true across all the principles, meaning it doesn't just load into one of the 4 principles. It loads into all the principles quite significantly, meaning they improve their understanding of why each of the 4 principles is critical compared to a control group. And I just want to be clear that this is not a thing where we're testing you on explicitly what we taught you in the training. These are questions that are kind of more behavioral based, meaning things like things that cops tend to respond to in a particular way, which is like, when I see someone, I can almost always tell whether there's something sketchy going on, for example, right? And we use their language and it's behavioral questions that don't explicitly ask about the ways, the concepts and the ways we talk. And so this is kind of a basic graph of the effects that we found. These are the standardized Z effects. And so in blue, you see kind of our effects on the procedural justice stuff, but then we also found some really interesting kind of secondary effects of the training. For example, the training increased institutional identification, or the extent to which police officers felt identified with the profession of policing and with the institution of the Mexico City Police. really interesting to us, like the training increased the perception that citizens had, that police officers had of citizens themselves. And so one of the questions that we had several questions asking police officers, like whether they trusted citizens and whether they thought that citizens understood them. And so there was a bunch of questions about the police officers' perceptions of citizens. It may or may not surprise you to know that police officers don't have very high opinions of citizens on average. But turns out that the training had a causal effect in increasing the perceptions that police officers had of citizens. And I'm happy to go into that if you're interested, because there's some interesting explanations behind that. And so these are some of the secondary effects that we found. It had no impact on occupational risk. And it did have impacts on their satisfaction with their job, on satisfaction with their peers, on their perceived importance of adhering to rules, on pro-social attitudes, on citizens' trust, and as I mentioned, on institutional identification. And so this is kind of I'm skipping through a lot of really interesting stuff, but I just want to give you the headline result for whether they understood it. Now I'm going to jump into quickly on the question of whether they internalized it. And so as I mentioned, we used a photojournal methodology to do this. And so we racked our heads a lot in terms of like, how do you measure if somebody changed their mind about something, or especially whether they changed their heart about something, right? And we ended up, after piloting a bunch of different things, landing on this photojournal methodology, which basically we asked police officers 6 months after we trained them, and in a way that they couldn't really associate with the training. It was really like it came from it seemed like a very different prompt. We said, during the next week, please take pictures of what it means to you to be a police officer, with respect to citizens, with respect to your peers, and with respect to your superiors. And so that was the basic prompt. And so they went out for a week, they came back, and then we did in-depth interviews with them where we would kind of lay out all the pictures that they took, and we would ask them to walk us through the pictures and tell us the stories behind each of the pictures. And so we recorded each of these interviews carefully. And this is kind of a sample of 4 pictures from one day of one of the police officers, where, you know, he was walking us through the 4 things he did that day. So first, he was helping at the entrance of a school. So you see a bunch of kids kind of, you know, posing in the pictures and wanting to be in the pictures with the cops. Then the second was a murder that he had to kind of be the first responder to. The third was an altercation because a car was blocking an entranceway, and so he had to get the car towed, and there was some altercation between the citizens because of this. And the fourth thing of that day was a police officer was killed in the line of duty during that week, and so he attended the funeral. So there are stories behind each of these pictures that kind of is the kind of data that we have. And so from that, what we end up doing is we have both line officers and middle managers that are pretty balanced in terms of treatment and control. We ended up with about 280 interviews with officers and 100 interviews with managers. And we asked them to show us the pictures, and we kept on asking a bunch of questions about kind of, how do you see yourself in relation to your work, and how does this picture help us understand it? And how do you see yourself in relation to citizens, et cetera? And so with those data, we basically followed a blind coding, meaning the coders didn't know what the study was really about, and they definitely didn't know whether they were coding for a treated or a controlled police officer. So we did a coding pilot first, and we calibrated them, and then we had a kind of a team review of the codes. And then based on this kind of adjusting of the coding of the interviews, we ended up with a final kind of coding matrix that included kind of 280 nodes of like, it was text by text coding. So we had the transcripts of the interviews, and they would go line by line and assigning codes to different lines that had to do with either procedural justice or how they related to their occupation or difficulties in their occupation, or a meta perspective, meaning kind of how do I think others see me? And then a meta perspective, which is how do I think that they think that I think about them? And so this kind of like whether I know what you know, and what I know that you know, and what I think that you know that I know, etc. Right? And so we have these meta perspectives and motivations and values. And then what we ended up doing is just tallying the types of quotes and the types of nodes and how they stacked. And then we kind of, after we did all of this, it was only at the end that we then said, like, well, is there a distribution that is different for treatment officers than for control officers in all these topics? And you can imagine that these interviews have a wealth of data that is unrelated to the training, that is just fascinating in terms of how police officers understand their work. But right now, I'm just going to very briefly walk you through the main findings and the differences between treatment and control. And so we group them in 4 categories, which is their interactions with citizens and procedural justice, professional behavior, the nature of the work, and the benefits of police-citizen interactions. And the effect sizes end up being pretty similar to what I described earlier, meaning like a 0.4 standardized Z, more or less. And so I'm going to quickly summarize what the key differences are between treated officers and control officers in how they talk about their work. I'm sorry that I can't go into a lot of depth, but I just want to give you the headlines of what we found. And I'm going to kind of breeze through this so that I can then also talk to you a little bit about the mystery shopper stuff. So basically, in terms of interactions, all officers say that interactions with citizens are tough, but control officers tend to say, you know, my job is to catch bad people, and citizens are most often a hindrance to that. They most often get in the way. Sometimes it can be helpful. Most of the time, they're just in the way of my work. Whereas treatment officers tend to say that citizens are the work, meaning my job is to build trust with citizens, and part of that job sometimes is catching bad people, but the core of my job is to work with citizens. And so that was a clear difference that we found. In terms of professional behavior, control officers tend to say that good cops change their behavior depending on who the citizen is and what the citizen looks like and what the situation is. And they talk a lot about their instinct and their gut. Whereas they tend to talk a lot about, complain a lot about the professional image as a physical image, like what equipment you wear and what your uniform looks like. And that's what they associate with professionalism the most. Whereas treatment officers, we do see they have a different way of thinking about professionalism. And it's much more likely to be about the idea that being a professional means that you don't let the behavior of others determine your standards or your own behavior. Right? And so we see that difference quite clearly. In terms of nature of the work, they all agree that police officers are not understood and people just don't get what we do. But in the control officer narrative, they're much more likely to quote unquote blame citizens. And they say just citizens don't get it and they must be educated. We deserve respect and we deserve gratitude for what we do, and citizens don't give it to us because they're kind of like, they don't get it and they should be educated. Whereas treatment officers agree that people don't get it and that officers are misunderstood, but they do say that it's on us to change it. We carry a history, and at the end of the day, we are the professionals. And so we are the ones who are responsible for reframing this relationship. And in terms of citizen trust, control officers tend to say like, well, it can sometimes be helpful with the citizens that get it. And so when I see a citizen that gets it, I try to build trust with them. Whereas treatment officers, they say like, without trust, we cannot do our work. So it is on us to rebuild. So those are kind of the differences that we found in the narratives. And again, you know, I can, at some point, if you're interested, I'm happy to send you our current draft of the papers where we document each of these and the kind of the statistical distribution of these differences. And finally, and I'm going to have to rush with this through this, but we do a mystery shopper evaluation to see whether people change their behavior. And the way this is designed is we tested a bunch of different situational protocols. We ended up landing on 2, which is an interaction with somebody who's been framed as a suspect and an interaction with somebody who is a trans woman and has been framed as indecent exposure in the street. The interactions last between 5 to 10 minutes. Police officers are called to the setting, like it's a call for service. They don't know that they're interacting with 2 professional actors who are enacting exactly the same script with everybody. We record this in audio and video, and then we do kind of very careful coding of what we found. So this is what the interactions typically look like. There's a citizen who is the accuser, who quote unquote called the police to complain either that this citizen is suspicious, and usually it's a minority young man who's being accused of engaging in suspicious behavior, or it's a trans woman who's being accused of indecent exposure. And so the police officer arrives and has to manage this interaction. So we record this, and then it's important to say that these three participants are blind to the whole thing. Actors did not know that this was a study about trust and procedural justice. They were just asked to enact this thing. And obviously they're blind to whether they're interacting with a trained police officer or not. And obviously police officers are blind that this is a mystery shopper intervention. And so we end up with, and the coders who then observe the videos and code the videos are also blind to what the study is about, and they're blind to whether police officers are trained or controlled. So we end up with three perceptions at the end as measures. At the end of each interaction, we ask the actors to talk about their subjective experience of that, which is pretty valid because they don't know what this is about. They're just asked how they felt that the police officer treated them. And then we also have the trained coder's perception of what happened. The summary that I can give you is that there's two big headline summaries. We found an effect of smaller size, but instead of 0.4, I think it's like close to 0.3 standard Z effect. But it was a very clear effect. And the most important thing that we found is that our treated officers were much less likely to end up in bad places, like meaning the interactions were just much less likely to escalate or to go down a bad path. That was a big, big difference. It's not only that they were more likely to do good things, they were especially much less likely to do bad things. One interesting feature is that we find a very clear relationship between how cops did in their surveys at Endline and their behavior. Basically, how you did on your survey at Endline explains close to 55% of the variation in how you did in the behavior. And so we see that there's a clear link between how you're thinking about these things and how you're acting. It's not surprising, but it's important that we are able to actually show this. And let me now quickly walk you through what I think is the most interesting finding of this behavioral stuff. Because even though, the three tend to agree on which interactions, like the three perceptions tend to agree on which interactions they thought were better and which interactions they thought they were worse. So on the headline, they agree that on which cops handle things better than others. But what's really interesting is that there's nuances in what they experienced in ways that I think are really interesting. And so when you look at the accuser, there's actually much less action. There's much less variance in how they perceive the police officers. It just moves less. Again, it's generally in agreement with the other two perceptions, but there's less movement in it. But the movement that there is tends to load on respect, meaning they perceive that certain police officers were more respectful towards them or not. But it also loads on emotions of anger. When there's a control officer, the accuser reports kind of having escalated things more and having been able to get more angry and express more anger at the accused, which shows that the police officer just didn't mediate as much and didn't kind of separate and control things as much. And so the accuser was much likely to push for the escalation of things. Fascinating to me, at least, the perception of the accused was quite different. Like, there's a lot of action here. Like, a lot of our results are driven by the perceptions of the accused. It all loads on neutrality, actually. And so what they experience from the police officers, or the biggest difference that they see between trained and control, is whether they're being neutral towards them, or whether they are not being discriminated against, basically. And they also report much less feelings of fear and anger. They report a lot more fear and anger with the control police officers. And the trained coder, what's most interesting is that there's a lot of action as well, meaning they see a lot of variance between trained and controlled police officers, but it loads on voice. And so what the observers are seeing is that what police officers are actually doing most visibly is they're giving voice to citizens, but this citizen is experiencing it as neutrality, and this citizen is experiencing more as respect, which I think is really interesting because it talks about this idea that justice is kind of actually co-constructed, and different participants in an interaction are going to have very different starting points and very different perceptions. And we all collectively construct a more fair or less fair interaction, and it can be quite path dependent. Meaning, one of the surprises that I found is that when things escalate, it's usually the accused who starts the escalation. Now, it's not unprompted. They usually start the escalation because the police officer behaved in a way that triggered them because they felt like they were being slightly discriminated against. And so the accuser gets on high alert, says something that is that kind of escalates the interaction, and the police officer follows suit. And so it's kind of these very interesting, nuanced path dependencies that we see in the co-construction of a more just versus a less just interaction. And this is all I have for you. And I'm really curious to get your questions and reactions. And I'm sorry that I spoke so quickly, but you saw that I really wanted to get through all the different components of the study so that we can discuss the implications and everything that we did. Thank you. And I'm now open to any questions or comments or disagreements or concerns you might have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So just a reminder for all of you, please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will start taking them live. We do have one question already. What are the factors for the remaining 45%? Subjective norms, for example?
I mean, a lot of it we don't quite know, but some of it seems to be driven by personal characteristics. So, for example, to the surprise of no one, women tend to have higher baseline levels of procedural justice instinct. More experienced cops tend to have lower procedural justice, but then be more responsive to the training. So there are a lot of kind of individual differences that explain some things. Sometimes factor like structural things matter. So whether you are in a more dangerous neighborhood, for example, if you're in a more dangerous neighborhood, you're less likely to have changed your behavior through the training. And so there's a lot of other factors that kind of end up absorbing some of those differences, and some of them we just don't observe, and I don't know.
Has there been any, or have there been any longitudinal measures of citizens' perceptions?
So two things. Number one, there are, but not as related to our study. And so we rack our brains a lot with, what do we do about citizen perception? And at the end of the day, if you think about how often you interact with a police officer, and we only trained 1,000 out of 80,000, and it was already an enormous undertaking, the amount of interactions that police officers would have to have out there in order for them to start moving the needle would just be enormous, right? And so that's why we thought that the subjective experiences of the actors would be a good way to get at this. I mean, like, how do you feel like prior to the interaction versus post the interaction? And so to the extent that we have the longitudinal experience of the actors, we do see that they are greatly affected in their perception of police officers by these interactions. And we do see them end up trusting police officers much more as a result of all the interactions they had, all the positive interactions they had with police officers. The longitudinal general surveys that we have about the police out there in general show that there's a declining trust in the police, except for police forces that in our other study, we know are doing careful work, and we know are reaching out to citizens, and we know have incorporated procedural justice into what they do. That includes some in the US, for example, Stockton, which is a very well-known example, and includes other in Mexico, such as Escobedo or Ciudad Neza, that are also very well-known examples of police forces that have kind of truly incorporated a citizen perspective into how they do things.
Great. So shifting a little bit, how hard was it to convince officers to complete a photojournal, and did their effort relate to control or treatment after the training?
To the second part, it didn't. We didn't see differentiated assertion of the work or accepting to do it between treatment and control. So in general, what I've always found as a researcher, I do a lot of qualitative work in my work. And what I've always found is that people really love to talk about themselves. And they especially love to talk about themselves when it's clear that you're genuinely interested and that it's a sincere interest in understanding them. And police officers, like, they feel so misunderstood and so misrepresented that when somebody genuinely tries to engage with understanding their perspective, in general, we have found like a 90% positive reaction to that. So like, oh, you're really interested. I love that. And they were very, in general, they were very proud of the pictures that they took, and they were very eager to tell us the stories behind the pictures that they
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the costs, or particularly cost per officer for the training compared to other approaches?
Well, I mean, there's two things, right? So one is, what's the counterfactual that we're comparing this against? And so training in and of itself is not necessarily cheap. You have to take police officers out for 3 days at least. We think it should be longer, but the shortest we could agree to do was 3 days. They need to be like, during those 3 days, they really need to be just in the training. They can't be kind of coming in and out. Like, they need to really focus and reflect. And so from that perspective, it's quite costly, and it has to be in small groups. If you do it in large groups, it doesn't work because it has this kind of interactive component to it. Now, two things. One is, police officers are trained all the time on a variety of different things. And so relative to other training programs that they're exposed to, this is not much more expensive. But the evidentiary backing to the effect that this has relative to other trainings is pretty significant. So in terms of bang for your buck, we think that this is actually a pretty good bet. If you think about, one of the biggest effects that we found, again, is it would reduce the probability that a police officer would do bad things. And if you think about how costly it is for a police organization when a police officer does bad things, anything that you do to lower the probability of that happening, I think is extremely worthwhile. And I think it's again, relative to the cost, the potential cost, I don't think the cost of training is that high. And there was a second component to that. There was a cost relative to the training and relative to other interventions. Mm-hmm. So one caveat that I always mention when I'm talking about this work is, one of the cool things that we could do is that we could test whether the impact on a police officer is different. The impact of the training is different depending on whether their manager had been trained or not. And what we found is that if your manager was trained before we evaluated you, you end up having a 30% larger effect than if your manager wasn't trained, which makes all the sense in the world because of what I mentioned earlier. If you don't experience procedural justice internally, it's very hard for you to enact procedural justice externally. But if we take kind of one step further, and this is something that we see a lot, if you train police officers in procedural justice, but you change nothing about their incentive systems, for example, how you're evaluating them, what's going to get a police officer recognized, what's going to get a police officer promoted, what's going to get a police officer fired. Like, if you change nothing about that, and most police organizations that I know evaluate police officers based on arrests and crime rates. And that creates a very specific set of incentives that are not particularly well aligned with procedural justice. And if that's how you're going to keep evaluating police officers, and you're only going to reward them for quote unquote heroic or aggressive acts of valor, and that's the only reward you get, then there's a very clear ceiling effect in what procedural justice can do, right? I still think it's a good idea, but I think there's a ceiling effect. Whereas if you do this and you couple it with kind of creating more complex but also more fair evaluation metrics for police officers, where you include the citizen perspective and where you include whether they are good at building trust, then all of a sudden I think you can truly reframe the way an entire force engages with citizens.
Do you have any plans for follow-up studies to measure impact over a longer period, and whether the treatment holds or any boosters may help extend impact over time?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, because basically in our relationship with the Mexico City Police, what they when they saw the result, they said, like, we need to escalate this for everybody. And so now we're in the process of helping them escalate for everybody else. We do plan to do some follow-ups and seeing what happens once everybody's getting the training and see, but like, police forces are it's difficult for me to describe to you the complexity of the logistics of a police organization. So this process of following police officers for 6 months was a nightmare logistically. And so we thought that 6 months, we would love for it to be then also a year, but just the cost was prohibitive relative to the funds that we had. And it was just logistically almost impossible. And so I think that that would be a really interesting follow-up thing. So yeah, the short answer is no.
We've got a few minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to share them. And while you're formulating those questions, we did get a side question about sharing the recording for people who jumped in later. We will be sharing a recording of the full presentation afterwards. So if you missed the beginning, never fear.
Yeah, and if also you're welcome to contact me directly, and I'm happy to share the papers and anything that you think could be useful and interesting from the discussion we've been having so far. But since while we wait for other questions, like one thing that I do want to emphasize is this idea of, I mean, where I ended up after doing all this research was truly convinced of the importance of procedural justice. Like it's hard for me to describe like how we did observe a transformation in the police officers, especially in how they were thinking about what it meant to be a professional. Like the narratives around these pictures really do sound different, and that made up my whole team kind of really convinced about the power of training people and procedural justice. And at the same time, we are all also completely convinced of this idea that without internal procedural justice and without changing how we think about the internal structure of the police force, there's just a really big ceiling effect in terms of how much can you expect the individual, how much do we put on the individual police officers? We always tend to say that anything good that happens, anything bad that happens, it's on the individual. Mm-hmm. And we just are quite convinced from all the work that we've done that there's a pretty low ceiling to that. And a lot has to be done in how the organization is thinking about itself internally.
We do have another question. How have these results been received by the CDMX top leadership? And have they discussed with you what they plan to do with this research going forward?
Yeah, and I know Scott, so hi, Scott. Thank you for the question. I mean, in general, the response has been extremely positive. In some ways more positive than we expected from the beginning. Like they were like doing this, again, it's a logistical nightmare. And so we put them through like a lot of complexities to do the research in the first place. But in terms of the results, they're in the process of escalating this right now. Like right now, we just finished a process of training all the trainers of the police academy in Mexico. Like you can imagine that the police academy in Mexico is big because there's 80,000 police officers. And so we just finished training the trainers of the police academy, and they're right now in the process of training all the commanders. They're going to train the commanders first based on our recommendation that you need a commander's buy-in before you should train the line officers. So they're going through that process right now, and there's a few thousands of them. And so that's going to take a while. I'm going to say a few weeks. And then once that's finished, then they're going to start putting like all police officers through procedural justice training. But one thing that's already happened is that we worked with them to kind of weave procedural justice into everything that is taught to new recruits at the police academy. So everybody who's coming into the police academy right now is receiving procedural justice training as part of everything that they do. And so they've been very receptive, and they've been quite kind of influenced by the evidence. And we really thank them and appreciate that they've done that.
So we don't have any more questions, and we are rounding out the hour. Oh, wait, just kidding. There's one more.
Anonymous attendee.
So were there any significant... Yes. Anonymous attendee asks, were there any significant differences in the change in behavior with respect to how many years the officer had served? Was the treatment more effective for newer officers versus tenured officers?
So this was a surprise to me because my expectation was that newer officers were going to be more sensitive to the training, and that's not what we found. What we found is that more experienced officers were more affected by the training. And we believe that it's partly because they have the experience of what doesn't work, and they could see that these tools were helpful for them to manage difficult situations. And so they were kind of just more likely to begin experimenting with them and actually change their behaviors, which afterwards made sense to me, but it was a surprise when we saw the results at the beginning, because I was expecting the opposite.
Great. Okay. This time we actually don't have any more questions, and we are coming to the end of the hour together. So I think that now is as good a time as any to close it out and say, first of all, thank you, Rodrigo, for sharing insights from your work with us and with our attendees. And thank you to the attendees for sharing your time and joining us to hear more about Rodrigo's work. As I mentioned before, we will be sending a recording of this session to each of you in the coming days. If you do have any lingering questions for Rodrigo or are interested in seeing any of the papers that he had mentioned, he has allowed us to share his email address so that you can reach out to him directly. It's at rodrigo.canales@yale.edu. And if you are interested in learning more about the fundamental principles of behavioral science or how to start thinking about applying it in your own work, we do have the next installment of our remote crash course in behavioral science that is coming up from November 30th to December 3rd of 2020. And like I said, it will be taking place entirely remote. We also have a couple more seminar series installments in the Ideas 42 Academy. The next one will be on trashing misconceptions about behavior through a reduction of waste in New York City public housing. That will be on October 20th. And finally, in November, we have another affiliate seminar series on using human AI integration and considerations for decision making with Renee Richardson-Gosline of MIT Sloan. And as ever, you can find more information about our full suite of Academy coursework and all of the events that I just mentioned at ideas42.org/academy. Thanks again to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you next time at the Ideas 42 Academy.
Mitra, thank you, and thank you, everybody. I wish I could see you all in the room in person, but I really appreciate it and enjoyed this. Thank you so much.